Okay, the rest of the poems in the fascicule were written in either the 19th or 20th century. So we move forward more than 100 years from Blake's The Tiger. We're in a very different historical context, a different stage in literary history, and we're on a different continent, right? Walt Whitman is the most famous American poet of the 19th century, and perhaps the most famous American poet, period, probably so. Um, Whitman's poetry is written in, for the most part, in free verse. The poem that we have here is written in free verse. Uh, Whitman publishes the first edition of his poetry in 1855, so right in the middle of the 19th century. And he's writing a poetry in free verse that is supposed to be the poetry of the new democratic century, a celebration of popular democracy, and a celebration of the United States as the country that embodies popular democracy in the 19th century. So we have an extended free verse poem whose subject is myself, right, the song of myself. But by singing the song of myself, Whitman is also trying to sing the song of democracy, popular democracy. I'll give a little bit of background on Whitman's career and on Whitman's publication history after reading this text. But just before I start, be aware that Song of Myself is an extended free verse poem. What you have here in the fascicule is an excerpt, the first two parts of a 33-part free verse poem. So you have a very small portion of the entire text of the Song of Myself. So contrary to the very concise, well-formed poems that we've been reading up until now, what we have here is an expansive, open, free verse poem. The idea being to celebrate myself, celebrate others, right? The relation between the self and others in a democratic country, but also to have a poetic form that is open enough and expansive enough to encompass the entire national experience of the US in the 19th century. A big, wide, open free verse poem that will be able to let in everything into Whitman's song. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease not till death. Creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard, nature without check, with original energy. Houses and rooms are full of perfumes. The shelves are crowded with perfumes. I breathe the fragrance myself and know it and like it. The distillation would intoxicate me also, but I shall not let it. The atmosphere is not a perfume. It has no taste of the distillation. It is odorless. It is for my mouth forever. I am in love with it. I will go to the bank by the wood and become undisguised and naked. I am mad for it to be in contact with me. The smoke of my own breath, echoes, ripples, buzzed whispers, love root, silk thread, pot and vine, my respiration and inspiration, the beating of my heart, the passing of blood and air through my lungs, the sniff of green leaves and dry leaves, and of the shore and dark-colored sea rocks, and of hay in the barn, the sound of the belched words of my voice loosed to the eddies of the wind, a few light kisses, a few embraces, a reaching around of arms, the play of shine and shade on the trees as the supple boughs wag. The delight alone, or in the rush of the streets, or along the fields and hillsides, the feeling of health, the full noon trill, the song of me rising from bed and meeting the sun. Have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Have you practiced so long to read? Have you felt so proud to get at the meaning of poems? Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. You shall possess the good of the earth and sun. There are millions of suns left. You shall no longer take things at second or third hand, nor look through the eyes of the dead, nor feed on the spectres in books. You shall not look through my eyes either, nor take things from me. You shall listen to all sides and filter them from yourself. Okay, there's a lot there. There's only two parts of the whole poem, and it's already a lot more text than any of the other poems in the fascicule. Um, and I did that because I think it's necessary to get a sense of the expansiveness of Whitman's verse in order to appreciate what he's trying to do in his poetry. If I just gave you 10 lines, it would not be enough to get a sense for the way that Whitman's verse functions. It's a free verse in the sense that, right, there's no regular meter, there's no rhyme scheme, obviously. The stanzas, the lines vary in length. It's also a free verse in the sense, right, in the more abstract sense, of being free to move wherever the mind of the poet or wherever the experience of the poet takes it, right? It's free to encompass all of the aspects of the poet's life, to embrace all of the different experiences that make up 19th century America, or more generally, that make up popular democracy. If you want to read further in Whitman, the place to do further reading of Walt Whitman online is here, the Whitman Archive, where you have his published works, his manuscripts, his life and letters, and so on. In the published works, right, we go into the published works. Look at this. We have all of the different editions. We can look at images of pages. Okay. We can thumb through the text, looking at the specific pages of this edition of Leaves of Grass. This is the dedication. Still on the frontispiece is, sorry, picture of Whitman, title page, and then we move into the poetry. So you can go through the whole text. This is the prologue to the first edition. You can go through the whole text in this way if you like, reading a facsimile of the original manuscript. Or you can read complete edition in this way, where you have the image of the text. Okay, so I can click on this and I'll get the image. But then you also have a transcription of the text. So here's a transcription of the prologue. And then you'll have after this, as I scroll down, a transcription of the verse. Okay, so this is what we've just been reading. The first lines of Song of Myself. Okay, and you can read through the whole poem in that way. You'll notice this is the first edition that I'm looking at here. In the first edition, we don't have these section numbers, the 1, 2, these come in later. So if you want to just thumb through the text of Whitman, the place to do that as you lean and loaf at your leisure is in this Whitman archive. Song of Myself, as I said, is Whitman's most famous work. It's the work that stands at the center of his of the publication history of his poetry. It gets reworked in each future edition of Whitman's poetry. And Whitman's poetry is basically one book. This book here, Leaves of Grass. Here you see the first edition, right, imitating the roots of the grass. Leaves of Grass is a collection of poems that Whitman first published in 1855, and then he republished every 5 years or so until the end of his life in 1892. So Whitman was a poet who wrote one book over and over and over and over again. That book became sort of connected to his life. His experiences, his lived experiences, were transferred into the poetry of Leaves of Grass, which sort of grew organically between 1855 and 1892. And that's the one book that he publishes in different forms over the course of his life. At the center of that book, Leaves of Grass, you have the poem that's in the fascicule, the excerpt of the poem in the fascicule, Song of Myself. The connection between the self and the poetry, we see it here in the first edition with this image of Whitman on the left page, next to the title page, Leaves of Grass. This democratic, average-looking, middle-aged man looking out at the reader with a casual hat on his head, his collar opened, his head sort of tilted to the side, inviting us to engage with the work that we're about to read, as though this work comes from the poet we see presented on the page next to us. Leaves of Grass, a title which is supposed to symbolize democracy, okay? Both something that is connected to nature, right? Grass, right? The grass of the fields, of the lawns. So something that grows out of nature, like democracy is supposedly growing out of the natural evolution of society, the natural place that each person should have in a democratic society, according to Whitman. So this connection between the natural democratic order and the green world, the natural world, the organic world that we inhabit. Leaves of Grass, also a symbol of democracy, because grass is not a difficult plant to maintain, right? Grass is hardy. It's not a fragile rose. Grass grows easily. It grows everywhere. It grows amongst the poor and amongst the rich. It grows in the north and it grows in the south. It grows through all seasons. It can withstand being worn down and so on. So the fact that it is present everywhere for everyone, that it resists the wearing of time, the passage of the seasons, and so on, makes it seem for Whitman to be an ideal symbol of democracy. And then finally, Leaves of Grass. Usually you don't speak of leaves of grass, right? Usually you speak about the grass as sort of a collective thing. So the idea, leaves of grass, you can look at the grass as many individual leaves, or you can look at it collectively. If you focus right closely, you can focus on the individuality of each leaf or each blade of grass in a lawn. If you step back, you see it collectively, right? You have a different impression. So that too is like democracy, according to Whitman. There are many individuals that make up something which is a harmonious, natural whole. In the first stanza, of Song of Myself, which I just read, the first section, second stanza, you have the image of the poet observing a spear of summer grass, right? One leaf of the grass, but you can also stand back and see the grass collectively. So this give and take, this movement back and forth between the individual and the group, is also something which, according to Whitman, evokes democracy. All right. So there are some resources to look into a little bit more depth about at Whitman's poetry, at this poem "Song of Myself," if you like. A text which has huge influence on later American literature, but also later world literature. Whitman is one of the precursors for the Rimbaud of for the Rimbaud of oh, good grief, Saison en Enfer. My goodness, I'm drawing a blank. For the Rimbaud of Saison en Enfer, right? This idea of a poetry which is an expansive free verse relating the experience of the poet in a certain register. Sorry about that. Okay, there are so many things to say about this poem that I'm just not going to be able to say everything. Obviously, that's a good thing. So please do read around what I'm going to say. Uh, Develop your own ways into Whitman. The idea of Whitman is it's a poetry that's supposed to open possible experiences for the reader, right? Uh, he mocks in this passage that I've just read, he mocks the idea that you can get at the meaning of poems. The meaning of poems is to be able to release your power, the reader's power, to see things with fresh eyes, to experience things in a general way, in a genuine, way. Um, so, what I'm about to say is by no means exhaustive, and it's not the point of Whitman's poetry for me to try to get at the meaning of the poem. Okay, so I hope that's very clear. First of all, for the context, a little bit more on the context. This poem was written in 1855, a time of popular democracy in America, and a time when the United States is expanding westward, right? It's the westward expansion of the United States in these years, while also dealing with the divisive moral and political issue of slavery. Okay? So the celebration of the self and the dignity of the individual and the uniqueness of each individual's experience in Whitman's Song of Myself is to be read in the context of this country which is growing from the energy of popular democracy, and which is struggling with the moral and political question of slavery. Later in Song of Myself, if you read more of this poem, you'll see Whitman specifically evoke the question of the slave's experience, the dignity of the slave in society, and the sin that society is committing, sin or crime, as you like, that society is committing against those who are enslaved, who are as great as any other member of society. This idea of a democratic equality between individuals in society is desecrated by slavery. And so Whitman uses this approach to popular democracy as a way of condemning slavery. One of the most famous scenes in Whitman's poem is the presentation of the slave at auction. Whitman, by presenting the slave who is being sold, uh, creates the contrast between his celebration of the human being, the celebration of the beauty of the body, of the mind of this person being sold, and the economic and social context, which tries to force us to see that person as a commodity, right, as a thing to be bought and sold, rather than to see the humanity of the slave. So that context of a country which is growing fast while also struggling with this deep moral dilemma of slavery is something to bear in mind as you read this poem. By celebrating popular democracy, Whitman is also condemning other aspects of American society in these years. And of course, this poem is written in 1855, published in 1855. 6 years later, the United States is engaged in the Civil War. The country tears itself apart because it's unable to come together and celebrate itself and celebrate the union that exists between all individuals in society. So that context is important to bear in mind. Another thing that's important to bear in mind is the way in which Whitman refuses certain conventions that are common in poetry at this time. He refuses certain habitual assumptions of, let's say, polite poetry. So, for example, there's an anti intellectual streak here. Uh, that's going too far, maybe. Um, there's a refusal to submit to established practice. Let's put it that way. So the final stanza of the first part, when he talks about creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back, sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten, I harbor for good or bad, I permit to speak at every hazard, at every chance, right, at every occasion, nature without check with original energy. Creeds and schools, the knowledge of the past and the religions of the past are not to be used as guides. We mustn't forget them, but we can't allow our experience to be established by creeds, religions, or schools, philosophies that have existed in the past. We have to live in the present. So he's writing a poetry which is based in this dynamic present. And what is important is a genuine experience of this dynamic present. I speak as I experience nature, the world around me, without check, right? Without stopping myself, without allowing myself to be stopped by beliefs or past ideas, with original energy. So, this notion that we can allow past knowledge, past religion to fade into abeyance, right? That's not what's important. What is important is to capture the dramatic energy of the present and to speak directly to that original energy of the present, right? To speak in a sincere, direct way, even if it means contradicting things that we thought we knew, even if it means engaging in speech that might be considered vulgar in polite society. So if you look here, the line that I'll put right at the bottom of the screen, the sound of the belched words of my voice loosed to the eddies of the wind, right? I'm shouting, my voice is being shouted out into the wind. This idea of a dramatic creation in the present, and to belch, right, is it's a vulgar word. Right? It's like burping or allowing the air in your lungs to come out without control, right? It's being blown out of the lungs uncontrollably, like a giant belch of air coming out of a chimney of a factory, for example. So we have imagery here that does away with decorum, right? Traditional polite poetry, and that does away with the idea that we should be checked, that we should stop ourselves within the limits established by past schools or by past religions. Okay, two other things to say along this line. The passage that's on the screen here, the atmosphere is not a perfume, Whitman is emphasizing, first of all, the senses, and then secondly, beginning with, I am mad for it to be in contact with me, a celebration of the body. Okay? We have a sensual poetry, a celebration of the senses, and we have a celebration of the body. How do we experience nature without check? We experience it through the body, we experience it physically. We are very used to this now in the early 21st century. It's something that doesn't seem shocking to us in our time. But at the time Whitman is writing this, the idea that the soul and the body are to be considered equal is a surprising one. The idea that the senses and the intellect are to be considered equal is a surprising one. He's doing away with the traditional hierarchy where the body is simply a vessel for the soul, right? Where it's the spiritual that is more important than the physical, where the physical or the bodily is degraded. Same thing with the intellect and the senses. Typically, the intellect is considered noble, whereas the senses are considered to be more base, right, or more basic. Whitman, in the way that he structures his free verse, says, no, I will have none of that. There is an equality between the body and the soul. There's an equality between the senses and the intellect. Experiencing nature without check is allowing the body to be freely and directly expressed, right? We have a presentation of the body which is direct and unabashed, which would seem vulgar in Whitman's time. Look at the second stanza again. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. I, right, we assume the body, right, the loafing, right, lazily, I'm lazily lying on the ground, inviting the soul. The body and the soul are together as equals in this line. Okay. Next, let's look at the way in which Whitman makes these points. I think I've covered the themes that are most obvious, and as I said, obviously, there are many things more we could say about this poem. I'm not going to go into too much depth either. If we focus now on the way in which Whitman speaks, look at the rhythm of the poetry. I've said that this is a free verse poem, but I hope that I was able to do some justice as I read to the rhythms of the verse. It's not because it's free verse that there's no rhythm. It's not prose, right? It's free verse. So we have this sort of ebb and flow, pauses that are established in lines. And we have the use of repetition, right? Look at the first three lines, the repetitions of myself, assume, and belong, right? That establish a rhythm in the lines. We have to give equal weight to each half of the line, and we have one half associated with each appearance of those key words. Okay? Second stanza, the repetition of loaf that we have, right? Which gives a certain rhythm to the transition between the two lines. Okay? More basically, if we move down to the third stanza, repetition of articles, demonstratives. Okay? This soil, this air. Okay? This soil, this air. The repetition of the demonstrative, right, gives a certain structure to that line. So repetition is going to be deeply important to Whitman's writing. And that also includes the repetition of sounds. So we talked about alliteration in The Tiger. We have numerous examples of alliteration in Song of Myself. Right? It's free verse, but he's using alliteration to structure many of these lines. So if we look at line 5 on the page in front of you, lean loaf, okay? observing a spear of summer grass, right? And it's not just the alliteration, spear summer, it's also the repetition of the sound. Okay, that s sound which comes in. Uh, we begin with, with spear, but there's also a transition with the z sound. Ease, observing, okay? So we have an L sound, lean, loaf, ease, observing, a spear of summer grass. Okay, we have three dominant sounds which are repeated and which sort of allow us to make to navigate. That's the word I'm looking for. They allow us to navigate this long line. So alliteration and then assonance, the repetition of a dominant sound, a vowel sound. Okay, alliteration, assonance, repetition of words, also repetition of sounds. Now, if we build a little bit more on that, we think about the structure of the lines at the beginning of this poem. We have this back and forth, back and forth. I celebrate myself and sing myself. What I assume, you shall assume. Belonging to me belongs to you. Okay, we have this ebb and flow between the speaker and the person being addressed, the reader. I and you, I and you, that which I am, that which is other than me. Okay, so it's not simply the I celebrating itself, right? It's the I engaging with another, and it's this dialogue, if you like, or this ebb and flow between what is me and what is other that creates the celebration. So, one of the criticisms that you will see leveled against Whitman, people who dislike Whitman's verse, and Whitman is one of those poets that typically you either love or hate. People who dislike Whitman's verse will often point to the uh, omnipresence of the I, right? This dominant speaking voice that is trying to impose itself on the reader. So the fact that he will write 33 parts of a song about myself over about 50 pages, depending on the edition, where the I is speaking to a you and telling the you what I assume, you shall assume. Okay? This idea of the I subjugating the you is something that people who resist Whitman's poetics will often point to. People who, the response that can be made to that, the response that can be made to that criticism is that, well, no, it's not an idea of the I dominating the you. The I exists through the dialogue with the you. And this celebration of Whitman's self, the celebration of the poet's self, is a celebration that can also be embraced by the reader, that also allows the reader or the you to see things anew with fresh eyes, with a sincere experience of the present. And the thing that makes this excerpt fit, I think, just with these two parts, look where we begin. We begin with the celebration of me, I, right? What I assume, you shall assume, which can seem like an authoritarian gesture. But the I is not simply Walt Whitman, not simply the poet, not simply one biographical presence. The I is what Whitman described as being the democratic self. The I is a figure for anyone, right? The I is created through its encounters with others. So the I comes into being through its exchanges with otherness, with all of the yous that it will encounter as it moves through the world, right? Through experience. The democratic self. So it's the song of myself, not just the song of the poet, but also the song of the democratic self writ large. And we begin the extract in the fascicule with this celebration of the self. Where do we end the extract in the fascicule? With the you, right? You. Look at the repetitions again, just like in the stanza above. Have, the repetition of questions. We end with a celebration of the you, encouraging the you to possess the origin, right? If you stay with me, you shall possess the origin of all poems. That is to say, in yourself, right? In your ability to come back up here, in your ability to speak at every hazard, nature without check, with your original energy. Okay? You shall not look through my eyes, nor take things from me. You shall listen to all sides and filter them from yourself. Okay? So we begin with myself in the first part, we end with yourself in the second part. And for those who appreciate Whitman's poetry, typically it's this gesture of ebb and flow, movement between the self and the other, this engagement in a continual dynamic exchange, right? This dialogue between a democratic me and a democratic you uh, that people most appreciate. Okay, so there's two ways of looking at Whitman's Song of Myself. The Song of Myself, that is to say, a first person voice which comes to dominate, a first person voice which imposes itself and which structures the poem. And there are perfectly legitimate reasons for adopting that approach. Okay, especially today when we can be sensitive to the fact that we have a middle class, middle aged white man speaking for the self of all America and trying to encompass all America into his voice. Right, that's something that people can be uncomfortable with for very understandable reasons. But there's also this element in Whitman's poetry that the dialogue that he is presenting is a dialogue that is open, right? Is a dialogue that can be filtered from the reader in any number of different directions, that can be continued in different forms, in different times, independently of Walt Whitman publishing a book in 1855 in Brooklyn, New York, addressing the crisis of mid 19th century America. Okay, I think that if I try to do more, I will probably do too much. I've given you a number of different, I think, points of entry into the poem. And I think maybe the most useful thing I can do to conclude is to point you back to this resource where you have commentary, where you have all of Whitman's published works, where you have facsimiles of the different books that were published during his lifetime, so you can see how his poetry grew over the course of his life. Um, Whitman's poetry is very much a universe to be explored, right? It's not an extract on a page and a half in a fascicule that's going to give you a full sense of Whitman's project. What I hope I've done is introduce free verse to you, introduce this democratic 19th century context, okay? How poetry begins to change, the attitude towards poetry begins to change as we move across the Atlantic and into the era of popular democracy. And I hope I've given you an introduction to some of the themes that are at the center of Whitman's writing. All right. Next week, I'll give you recordings on the next 5 poems in the fascicule, starting with Emily Dickinson's A Narrow Fellow in the Grass. Dickinson is a nice transition from Walt Whitman because she is writing in the United States in the middle of the 19th century, similar geographic, historical context, and she writes in a completely different way. Right? Dickinson and Whitman can be seen as sort of opposite sides of 19th century American culture in many ways. So we'll make that transition next week.